Peter leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He had stayed late at the office, reviewing the financial reports of his restaurants. He had a whole chain of them now. The numbers were encouraging. Business was booming, not entirely without problems. Of course, there are often various incidents that have to be regulated and cleaned up. It is a business. But in general, the restaurants were thriving, which of course could not help but encourage. Who would have thought it? Many years ago, Peter was starving. He dreamed of a portion of potatoes with a cutlet, a piece of chocolate cake, a glass of milkshake with foam. And now he's feeding half the city himself. Yes, life is a director. Now Peter is rich, really rich, big business, bank accounts. He can afford to travel anywhere in the world, expensive cars, clothes from famous designers. True, here are the trappings of a luxurious life. All this tinsel, not for him it. The main thing, the man now does not need help. He helps himself. It's so nice to be able to make someone a little happier. Peter regularly transfers money to foundations that collect money for the treatment of people, and of course, sponsors several orphanages. Most of these institutions are located in the capital of the country, where Peter has been living for more than 20 years. But the man does not ignore the orphanages in the countryside and has not left a small provincial town without attention. Dusty streets with broken sidewalks, weedy squares overgrown with weeds. There reigns desolation and tranquility. It's where Peter spent his childhood. A man often reminisces about his early years, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. Pictures from the past sometimes rise up before his eyes by themselves. Peter does not chase these memories away. On the contrary, he likes to think about the fact that he was able to get out of the pit, to stand, to survive, to become strong. In addition, his own story does not let him forget that there are many boys and girls in the world who need support and attention. His children, his son and daughter, are already old enough to talk to them about serious things. Artem is in the 8th grade. Dasha is a year younger. Peter has long since told them about his life. At their age, he had a hard time. Children need to know that the world is not equally fair and kind to everyone. Both Artyom and Dasha are lucky. Everything comes easy to them, so to speak, by birthright. But this does not mean that others are doing the same. Son and daughter are well aware of how many underprivileged children there are in the world and empathize with these people, which especially pleases their father. Artyom still sometimes travels to orphanages with Peter. They see everything, know everything, and even created their own group and social networks to help orphan children. They collect clothes, toys, play good guys. Peter was afraid of spoiling his heirs too much, and he didn't want his son and daughter to turn into soulless pro-lifers. Such a fate often awaits the children of wealthy parents. Peter had seen enough of such offspring. Permissiveness, indifference to other people's misfortune, confidence that the world revolves solely around them, what a sight. Peter did his best to make Artyom and Dasha grow up sensitive, empathetic, attentive, and he succeeded. They succeeded. His wife, Irene, supported her husband in everything. They have known each other for many years, almost all their lives. Irene also grew up in an orphanage. The girl was abandoned in the maternity hospital after she was born. Quiet, modest, unrequited, just like Peter. She was for a long time the object of cruel jokes for local leaders, a whipping girl, a person to assert herself, to take out her frustrations on. Peter was the same way. He tried not to run into the guys, lived in constant fear and flinched at every rustle or loud sound. He became strong largely for her sake, for Irene's sake. He couldn't stand up for himself, but it was unbearable for him to see this quiet, big-eyed girl being hurt. They became friends with Irene. At first they played together, discussed problems and worries. Both of them had no one to share their joys and sorrows with, in each other. They saw attentive interlocutors, support and acceptance. Later, somehow imperceptibly, all this grew into romantic feelings. And then Peter's life changed abruptly. From the miserable orphanage with its gray, shabby walls, stinky mattresses and sticky porridge in the morning, he suddenly found himself in a completely different world. No, Peter wasn't adopted. He was a teenager at the time. Who wants one of those? People prefer to adopt cute little babies. That's not what happened. In general, Peter lived in a family until he was 9 years old, and it was a wonderful family. The man's heart still ached when he thought of his parents. It's a shame they can't see what their son has accomplished. It was a shame that Peter couldn't do something good for them. He has a lot of money now, and fulfilling his mother and father's dreams is not a problem for him. Dad kept talking about a new car because the old one kept breaking down. Mom wanted to go to the sea. She had been to the resort only once, and now she dreamed of repeating this trip. But they have been gone for more than 30 years. Peter and his family lived poorly, but they were never poor. They had a clean, cozy 2-room apartment in which the young heir allocated a whole room. There was an old car. On it, my father took the whole family to the river, then in the woods. Those were wonderful trips, even if not to the sea. Peter never went hungry. Yes, sometimes there was not enough money for candy or ice cream, but there was always a pot of soup or roast in the refrigerator. Mom worked as a painter. Dad worked at the factory and the shop. We had enough money to live on. Peter didn't think about such things at all back then. He enjoyed life, a quiet, sunny childhood, socializing with his parents and friends. His mother and father never quarreled. At least Peter didn't remember it. They never raised their voices at their son, even if he had done something wrong. Parents always spoke to Peter as an adult, always explained the consequences of his behavior, told what can lead to excessive carelessness. Peter, in turn, tried not to upset them. He took care of his own and studied well, did not hooliganize. We have no one else, only us. And that is why it is important for us to take care of each other, to protect each other, his father told him. Peter liked such conversations. Their family seemed to him a friendly, close-knit team. Mom, Dad, him, they were a mountain for each other. It was wonderful to have that kind of support behind him. Peter learned that both his parents had grown up in an orphanage. Sometimes one of them would tell stories about those years. Peter listened to these stories with his mouth open. Mom and Dad's childhood was very different from his own. Indifferent teachers, angry children, a life of starvation. And no one, absolutely no one cared about these boys and girls. Peter was glad that he lived with loving and understanding parents. Then the boy could not imagine that one day he himself would end up in an orphanage. He could not have dreamed of such a thing. He has a mom and dad, they love him very much. For complete happiness, grandparents are not enough. Many friends have them, and it is great to drink tea with grandmother's cakes, to go fishing with grandfather. But what can you do? That's life. But his parents are the best. Peter remembered that warm summer day forever. He still sometimes dreamed of flying on his scooter into his hometown yard through the archway. The cool dusk is replaced by bright sunlight and heat. The smell of heated grass hits his nose. Next to Lyonya, a faithful friend and comrade. They have been sitting at the same desk since the first grade. Lyonya laughs, talks about something. And Peter, he immediately notices the crowd of neighbors at his entrance, and his tiny heart shrinks with misgivings. Peter still could not understand how he, 9 years old, at first sight, then guessed that his parents are in trouble. The boy suddenly wanted to see his mom or dad, so that right now they, as it usually happens, dispel his fears. But his parents had gone to the village in the morning to buy meat. They often went to the local farm. Products that were fresh, real, useful, so said Mom. So today they went. Peter often went with them, and he liked these mini vacations. You sit in the back seat, look at the road, and there are all fields and hills, a picturesque sight. Mother and father are quietly talking about something, making plans. It's nice, peaceful. There's a lot of interesting things in the village itself. Even the smell is different there. Mom always wrinkles her nose, saying it smells like manure. But Peter likes it for some reason. There are a lot of animals in the village: horses, cows, and goats. It's a common thing for the local kids. And Peter always looked at these animals, opening his eyes in amazement and admiration. But that day, the boy stayed at home. Leo offered to ride scooters in the new park. There are special paths and a fountain recently opened. How could he resist? The parents didn't mind. They always took their son's opinion into account, even when he was a baby. All right, stay home if you want. Mom smilingly stroked Peter's hair. We'll bring you something nice, Dad promised, settling into the driver's seat. Peter nodded happily. He and his friend saw his parents off together, standing in the driveway. And of course, at that time, he could not even think that he was seeing them for the last time. The boy waved his hand and then set off with his friend to meet the adventure. It was a wonderful day. Peter and Leo had a lot of fun riding on the new paths, getting acquainted with local guys, splashing in the fountain. Friends had time to climb trees and play with a stray dog and chase pigeons. It was fun. Summer vacation is the best time. So it was until the moment that divided the boy's life into before and after. The changes began at the moment when Peter noticed the neighbors at his entrance. These people, familiar from his earliest childhood, looked anxious, worried, and confused. They were discussing something. Leo had not noticed them yet. He kept telling Peter some anecdote, but he was not listening. The boy's attention was fixed on his neighbors. He desperately wanted to see his father or mother among them. They should be back by now, but his parents weren't there, which was scary. It was really scary, to the point of numbness in his fingers and goosebumps on his back. Finally, one of the neighbors noticed Peter. He said something to the others, and now about a dozen pairs of eyes were staring at the friends. Immediately, the boy felt a large shiver begin to hit him. The first thing Peter was hugged by Aunt Anne, his mother's friend. She often came to their house for tea and always brought something delicious for the master's son. "Trouble," she said, looking into the boy's eyes. "There has been trouble, terrible trouble. You must be strong, Dot." Neighbors told Peter that his father did not manage to control the car, and the car at high speed flew into the ditch. There was a hole in the road. It wasn't there before, but it was hard to notice it right away. A fault of the road service. Now the dangerous area has been fenced off. No one else will get hurt. But Peter's parents died in that terrible accident. Both of them. It was hard to realize, even harder to accept. How could it be, mother and father? They were something fundamental, something immutable. Peter even lost consciousness for a while. I woke up at Aunt Sveta's house. She managed to call the doctors. The doctors came and gave the boy some kind of injection. Everyone looked at Peter with sympathy, stroked his head, hugged him. It made it even more frightening. The boy did not think about his future. He was in a very strange state. Everything around him suddenly faded, somehow slowed down. Peter saw the world as if from the outside, as if he was just an observer, not a participant of this life. The neighbors took care of the funeral. Peter stayed with Aunt Sveta. He didn't want to go home. It was frightening to enter an empty apartment where Mom and Dad were gone. Aunt Anne sent her little ones to her mother-in-law for a while. And at work she must have taken time off, because Aunt Anne was always near Peter, did not leave him for a minute. Aunt Anne often cried when she thought the boy couldn't see or hear her. Next to Peter, she tried to speak in a cheerful voice, even smiled. It looked unnatural. The boy did not go to his parents' funeral. Only friends and neighbors saw them off on their last journey. Peter had a hysteria the night before. He screamed, sobbed, convulsed, which incredibly frightened not only Aunt Sveta, but also himself. The boy would have liked to calm down, but he just couldn't. They took him to the hospital, gave him some pills, gave him a few shots, and everything around him became unimportant. Peter lay on the bed and looked up at the white hospital ceiling. Not a very exciting thing for a boy to do. But it didn't seem so at the time. A few days passed. The boy seemed to come to his senses. Neighbors were allowed to visit him in the hospital courtyard. The boy sat on a bench between Aunt Anne and Aunt Rita. Both had their arms around his shoulders. Opposite stood more people from their home. All of them were sad, even gloomy. "You'll have to live in an orphanage for a while, won't you?" the aunt finally said. Anne's voice trembled. "We'll visit you," Aunt Mary added immediately. Peter shuddered. Up to now, he had not thought about where and with whom he would live. It was too much to think about at once. But now, when he heard the phrase orphanage, he was startled and frightened. How could it be? His mom and dad had grown up in an orphanage. They spoke many times that their son was very lucky to be born in a family. And now he would have to go to an institution like this. Tears came to the boy's eyes. He tried to force them inside, but nothing worked. Neighbors calmed him down, promised to come to visit him, and even take him for the weekend, if the management of the orphanage would allow it. But Peter understood then, at his age of 9, sitting on a bench in the hospital courtyard, he realized that now he was alone, all alone. No more of their wonderful team. From now on, he would have to make his own way. Something told the boy that it would be difficult. You need to collect yourself, prepare for a long struggle. But then he had no idea what he would have to face. Looking ahead, it should be said that the neighbors did visit the boy. At first, Aunt Anne, always dressed up, always with hotels, came most often, hugged Peter, asked him about his life. But then these visits became more and more rare and finally came to naught. The boy was not offended. He understood everything perfectly. After all, he had to grow up sharply. People, they have their own affairs, their own worries. They don't care about the neighbor's boy. They would like to solve their own problems. 2 women took Peter from the hospital, one in a police uniform, the other in ordinary clothes. They did not talk to the boy, did not explain anything to him, only gave him orders. The orphanage at first glance resembled an ordinary kindergarten, which Peter had visited not so long ago. The same long 3-story building, the same green yard with playgrounds. The policewoman, having signed some papers, left. But the second escort took Peter inside. The boy was shown how everything was organized in the orphanage: several bedrooms, beds, a dining room, a playroom, and classrooms. The orphanage was outside the city, so the children did not go to regular school. Teachers came to visit them themselves. On the first day, Peter was beaten up by local boys just to show who was boss and stronger. The girls saw it and giggled gloatingly. Then, when the teacher came running to the noise, looking her in the eyes, these girls said that the newcomer himself fell down the stairs, when Peter also received from the teacher for carelessness. "You did well. You didn't complain," one of the assailants pronounced afterward. "I did the right thing. We would have beaten you up more for it later." Peter remained silent. He did not say anything to the teacher out of fear of incurring more anger, and certainly not out of a desire to take the trouble away from his tormentors. It was just that this woman, she didn't care. She couldn't help Peter. There is no help at all here. It's a hostile and evil world. The gray orphan days dragged on. It was hard to get used to it all. Instead of a small but own room, a bedroom for 20 bucks. Instead of mom's delicious homemade food, an incomprehensible brew. Instead of acceptance and heart-to-heart talks, complete indifference, at best indifference, or even anger and aggression. There were no friends here, no attentive, smiling neighbors. Peter was immediately disliked. After all, he had been a home child for 9 whole years. He was loved, he was happy, he was cared for. And these children, most of them did not know the comfort of home and love of relatives. They all had hard fates and believed that those who were more fortunate were now their eternal debtors. Peter could not stand up to this bitterness, not yet at that time. He was shocked by the behavior of his peers. The world was opening up from a completely different perspective, which was disconcerting. He had to adapt. Peter was often beaten, and it was impossible to predict what would come next time. The boy tried not to get in front of his offenders. But how can you do that if you have to sleep in the same bedroom with them every night? Peter was doused with water, tripped over, called names, insulted, spit on, thrown things at, and had to endure it all. Peter tried to make friends with these kids. Not that he liked them, not at all. He just wanted to make his life a little calmer and more pleasant. But nothing worked. He and these boys were like different species, no points of contact, no common themes. Boys from the orphanage embittered and understood only the language of force. They were very different from Peter's friends. Then Peter realized that life had made these children like that. When he became an adult, strong and wealthy, he began to help orphanages. If disadvantaged boys and girls will realize that at least someone cares, if they see help, kindness, sympathy. Maybe some of them will realize that the world is not only aggression and anger. Peter really wanted to hope for that. The man was happy that since his childhood, much in orphanages has become different. And when the favorite happy child had to adapt to the new life in an accelerated mode, study began. With surprise and annoyance, Peter realized that the lessons here are purely formal. The level of preparation of his classmates was incredibly low. Of course, Peter, who had always studied well, showed his abilities on the first day of school. It didn't happen on purpose. His classmates could not cope with the simplest tasks. They could barely read. Peter was very praised by the teacher. Finally, a smart student, it's a pleasure to work with such a person. Anne rejoiced. Peter smiled. He liked that he was finally noticed, that they were saying good things about him. But that very evening, he was beaten up by a mob of boys in the backyard. The girls, as always, watched from a distant distance and silently approved. "Here's to you, upstart." The boys chided. You think you're the smartest? Don't show off. Peter was hurt, offended, scared, but he learned his lesson well. He no longer shone with his knowledge in class, kept silent, made mistakes in tests on purpose, just so that he would no longer be praised, just so that he would not stand out. Irene was a classmate of Peter's. She was not a member of any group of girls. She was friends only with the same quiet girls that she was. These girls often became the objects of cruel jokes of their peers. Boys did not touch them, usually preferred to deal with the guys. But Peter quickly realized that girls can sometimes be even more cruel than boys. They invented such insults for Irene and her friends that the others' ears perked up. They also damaged their belongings, forced them to be on duty, and took away the treats the children were occasionally given in the cafeteria. Sometimes there were fights in the yard with bites and hair pulling with broken noses. The educators looked at all this through their fingers. They preferred not to delve into the children's conflicts, separated the children, punished, without discerning, all in a row. Some of them were not touched at all. As Peter realized later, some teenagers were simply afraid of adults. The staff of the orphanage knew a lot about the genes of these children, about their life before they came to the state institution, and guessed what they were capable of. It was easier for them to lock quiet Irene in a closet for 24 hours. The wolves would be fed and the sheep would be safe. Peter, too, had to sit in that closet many times for nothing, if you put it that way. But he even liked it there, quiet, dark, calm, no one pulls, no one calls to clean up, no one calls him names. Just sit there thinking. One bad thing, hunger, quickly began to pester the growing body. Life in the orphanage was half-starved as it was, and then there was punishment. But Peter got used to it in the end. As the years passed, Peter and Irene became good friends. Even romantic feelings began to appear between them. The homeboy had changed. He became stronger, more resilient, learned to fight back, all thanks to Irene. It was unbearable to watch how a crowd of girls mocked her, then in the corner clamped and start pinching, then forced to duty in the kitchen every day. Then she has to wash their socks in the bathroom, a whole mountain of socks. Peter once saw the girls kicking the unrequited Irene again and stood up for her. He knew exactly what he was doing. The girls were first taken aback and then started laughing. One of them, the strongest and toughest, pushed Peter against the wall. The blow was quite tangible, but the boy stood his ground and pushed her back. In general, of course, girls should not be hit. This postulate Peter learned in his past life, when he attended kindergarten. But in front of him now was not a girl, but a monster, unpleasant, evil, and ruthless. The girls, accustomed to resolving conflicts by swearing and fighting, pounced on Peter. But even though he was a puny boy, but still a boy, he fought back quite well, and at the same time understood perfectly well the girls will call for help guys. It would be more difficult with them. Peter secretly from everyone for a long time practiced hammering his fists with a bag of flour in the closet. The sack replaced his punching bag. If the strongest survive in this world, you have to become the strongest. Fool, you're going to get in trouble now, warned one of the girls, the recognized leader of the company. The ladies realized that they could not defeat the boy and proudly left. Peter understood perfectly well what their threats meant. They would tell their buddies about everything. They will definitely take revenge on Peter for his courage. Trouble really loomed ahead. But Irene, she looked at him so much like a savior, like a hero, and all the distant problems under that gaze faded, lost their significance. "Thank you," she murmured quietly. "But what about you now? They'll beat you up, won't they?" "Nothing," Peter waved his hand. "I'm not afraid of them, Dot." And at that moment, he really wasn't afraid of reprisals. He didn't care. What mattered was that Irene was looking at him in a special way and smiling. They sat together on the bench and talked for a long time afterwards, learning new things about each other. Turns out Irene's mom died in the hospital. It seemed to be a very young girl. The relatives did not want to take the child away. It was a shame for them. Apparently, such a fate of the granddaughter, in the opinion of relatives, was not a shame. That was Irene's story. Of course, payback caught up with Peter very soon. "Are you the coolest guy in the world now?" That's the question one of his attackers asked him. The question was, of course, purely rhetorical. Of course, Peter was beaten badly. The girls were nearby. They suggested to their defenders ways to humiliate the victim, one more sophisticated than the other. But that time Peter still fought back, managed to break a couple of noses, someone kicked in the stomach, and then found himself in the dust on the ground, and only he was beaten. But still the boys were surprised. The victim used to be speechless and toothless, and then all of a sudden it was like this. They began to touch him less. No one wanted to get hit in the teeth or nose. They still attacked in a crowd sometimes, but they didn't attack singly, not anymore. Peter sighed, stretched, turned off his computer. Time to go home. Tomorrow we can sleep in a little longer, spend time with the family. The man threw on a windbreaker, walked out of the office. His car was parked in the back of the restaurant. Where the trash cans stood, food that customers got fed up with was thrown into them. So it was a common mistake here for homeless people looking to satisfy their hunger. Peter was not surprised to notice an elderly woman in tattered clothes and sneakers clearly off someone else's foot next to the bins. Peter did not chase the homeless away from the bins. On the contrary, he asked the staff to leave the food in the containers on the site, not to throw it all in the bucket. He felt sorry for these destitute people. The woman, sensing the presence of a man, was frightened, shuddered, turned around, looked anxiously at the approaching man. Peter was dumbfounded. This old woman. No, this is simply impossible. She was very similar to the person who had once played a key role in his life. The man scrutinized the beggar's face. She was also looking at him, studying him. After a few years of survival in the orphanage, an amazing thing happened in Peter's life. A new English teacher, Jane, came to visit them. The class, as always, began to test her on the first day. Mean jokes, attempts to disrupt the lesson, even direct insults. Usually the teachers would either lose their temper or lose their temper, but Jane looked at the troublemakers with sadness and even pity. It was surprising. Peter, who as always was ashamed of his classmates, watched Jane with interest. He was an unusual person. He could feel it at once. The new teacher gave an interesting lesson, not torturing the class with the necessary rules, but playing cartoons in English. At first the pupils, out of habit, only tried to make jokes, but somehow they got involved, even the most disinterested bullies. Then Jan began to ask questions. Peter, to his own surprise, knew all the answers. He answered, and the teacher shook her head approvingly and smiled. She seemed to be impressed by the able pupil. She had not expected to meet such a person here. Peter was no longer afraid of the nudges and prods of the locals, so he answered as he saw fit. Jan asked him to stay after the lesson. "You're an amazingly talented boy," she praised Peter when the others had left. And he realized that the teacher had purposely not complimented him in front of his classmates so as not to arouse their envy. Wow, what an intelligent and sensitive person. Thank you. You clearly need to study in a different program. Your level is much higher, and may even get higher. I've seen a lot of kids, and I can see the ability right away. You're very capable. Thank you, repeated an embarrassed and delighted Peter. It had been a long time since anyone had been so attentive to him. As a result, the new teacher taught the boy a different, more complex program with bright and much more interesting textbooks, which she bought at her own expense. Jane's made Peter's life happier and more pleasant, filled it with a special meaning. And the other children liked her very much too. It was a rare teacher who interacted with the class not through humiliation and insults, but through explanations and frank heart-to-heart talks. Both girls and boys were drawn to her. But it was obvious to everyone that Jape singled out Peter. But there were no objections. The classmates could see that Peter was making great progress in English. He helped them too, and never refused anyone, even those who had recently beaten him up in the backyard. Peter swallowed one after another of the interesting English books Jane brought him. Then the teacher handed the boy a player with several CDs. Reading is one thing. You need listening too. English is a little hard to listen to, but you'll do fine. I know you will. Thanks. Only ... Peter looked doubtfully at the player. Such a thing. Expensive. I'm afraid I can't take it. Jane seemed to understand. I'll make arrangements with the principal. He'll let you into the classrooms after school at certain hours, when no one else is here. There you will study. Is that option okay with you? You bet. It was so nice to do something I love and interesting in the silence of an empty classroom. It is not only learning English, but also a great opportunity to be alone with myself. This privacy Peter really lacked in the orphanage. And here beauty. Peter often talked to Jane about more than just English. Somehow they became almost real friends. Peter told his teacher about his tragedy. It was so nice to share some moments from the past with anyone. The woman shook her head, sighing from time to time. "Oh, it's been hard on you, Peter. Not always the conversations between the teacher and the able student were so heavy and serious. Sometimes they laughed and joked. Sometimes they discussed the news. Sometimes they argued. And sometimes they were happy to find that they agreed. It was all interesting. Irene liked Jane too, but she was shy of the teacher. A girl of that age in general was afraid of everyone and everything. Peter saw that life in the orphanage had a negative effect on Irene. Kind and sensitive by nature, she could not withstand the pressure. At least now Irene has him, Peter. He'll take no offense. One day Jane suggested that Peter take part in a regional competition. He had to write an essay in English, decorate it with drawings and send it to another city. Why? You have a great imagination. Your knowledge of the language is at a high level. Everything will work out for you. Well, I don't know, Peter hesitated. Who was he? A boy from the orphanage. And the other children are home. They go abroad and tutor. How can he compare to them? I know, Jane said confidently. You'll do fine. What should I write about? The theme is summer vacation. Describe the perfect day of your happiest vacation. I think that'll do. Peter thought for a moment. He knew right away what kind of day he would write about. Mom and Dad were still with him then. They both had the day off. They got up early, got in the car early, and drove into the woods to get mushrooms. That day they saw a wild deer up close and personal. It jumped out on the road, gave the people a worried look, even trembled. And then suddenly, as if it realized that these people are not dangerous, some inner instinct guessed and just went about his business, began to nibble grass, giving himself to admire. It was a real miracle. All three of them froze, watching the cute animal. Then there was a wonderful picnic in the woods. Mom made her specialty pies with onions and eggs, which Peter loved so much. We picked a lot of mushrooms. In the evening, Dad fried potatoes with them. As a result, the new teacher taught the boy a different, more complex program with bright and much more interesting textbooks, which she bought at her own expense. Jane's made Peter's life happier and more pleasant, filled it with a special meaning. And the other children liked her very much too. It was a rare teacher who interacted with the class not through humiliation and insults, but through explanations and frank heart-to-heart talks. Both girls and boys were drawn to her. But it was obvious to everyone that Jape singled out Peter. But there were no objections. The classmates could see that Peter was making great progress in English. He helped them too, and never refused anyone, even those who had recently beaten him up in the backyard. Peter swallowed one after another of the interesting English books Jane brought him. Then the teacher handed the boy a player with several CDs. Eating is one thing. You need listening too. English is a little hard to listen to, but you'll do fine. I know you will. Thanks. Only ... Peter looked doubtfully at the player. Such a thing. Expensive. I'm afraid I can't take it. Jane seemed to understand. I'll make arrangements with the principal. He'll let you into the classrooms after school at certain hours, when no one else is here. There you will study. Is that option okay with you? You bet. It was so nice to do something I love and interesting in the silence of an empty classroom. It is not only learning English, but also a great opportunity to be alone with myself. This privacy Peter really lacked in the orphanage. And here beauty. Peter often talked to Jane about more than just English. Somehow they became almost real friends. Peter told his teacher about his tragedy. It was so nice to share some moments from the past with anyone. The woman shook her head, sighing from time to time. Oh, it's been hard on you, Peter. Not always the conversations between the teacher and the able student were so heavy and serious. Sometimes they laughed and joked, sometimes they discussed the news, sometimes they argued, and sometimes they were happy to find that they agreed. It was all interesting. Irene liked Jane too, but she was shy of the teacher. A girl of that age in general was afraid of everyone and everything. Peter saw that life in the orphanage had a negative effect on Irene. Kind and sensitive by nature, she could not withstand the pressure. At least now Irene has him, Peter. He'll take no offense. One day Jane suggested that Peter take part in a regional competition. He had to write an essay in English, decorate it with drawings and send it to another city. Why? You have a great imagination. Your knowledge of the language is at a high level. Everything will work out for you. Well, I don't know. Peter hesitated. Who was he? A boy from the orphanage. And the other children are home. They go abroad and tutor. How can he compare to them? I know, Jane said confidently. You'll do fine. What should I write about? The theme is summer vacation. Describe the perfect day of your happiest vacation. I think that'll do it. Peter thought for a moment. He knew right away what kind of day he would write about. Mom and Dad were still with him then. They both had the day off. They got up early, got in the car early, and drove into the woods to get mushrooms. That day they saw a wild deer up close and personal. It jumped out on the road, gave the people a worried look, even trembled. And then suddenly, as if it realized that these people are not dangerous, some inner instinct guessed and just went about his business, began to nibble grass, giving himself to admire. It was a real miracle. All three of them froze, watching the cute animal. Then there was a wonderful picnic in the woods. Mom made her specialty pies with onions and eggs, which Peter loved so much. We picked a lot of mushrooms. In the evening, Dad fried potatoes with them. Jane's apartment was just like her parents', and therefore familiar. 2 rooms. A small, cozy kitchen. Peter looked around with interest. It was obvious that Jane was a rich man. Simple furniture, inexpensive wallpaper. There was a special atmosphere in these rooms, warm, soft, and soothing. It must be nice to live here. Peter knew that Jane had a daughter, Angela, who was his age. I'd love to meet her. She must have raised an interesting person. He hoped that he would make friends with the teacher's daughter, and that it would be wonderful if he could have another friend. There were so few of them in his life, after all. The teacher never told her daughter much. They discussed all sorts of things, but not Angela. That was even more interesting. The boy had no idea what she was like. But as soon as Angela entered the apartment, Peter realized that they were unlikely to become friends. At that moment, she was explaining to a student at the kitchen table the rules of constructing complex English sentences. A kettle was boiling on the stove and an apple pie was cooking in the oven. Peter was anticipating a pleasant tea party. Then the door rattled open and a teenage girl appeared on the doorstep. She wore a daring miniskirt, revealing long skinny legs with sharp knees, a tight top, thick platform shoes, short hair dyed a strange green color, large eyes thickly lined with black, eyelashes clumped with a thick layer of mascara. Peter stared at the girl in surprise. He had envisioned Angela very differently. This Angela subtly resembled the aggressive girls from the orphanage, and not even in appearance. Well, maybe the girl likes this image? It doesn't matter. Everyone has the right to express themselves. It was something else. Cold, prickly gaze, lips pressed contemptuously together, deliberately swaggering movements. Angela, hello. Jane smiled at her daughter. This is Peter. I told you about him. Remember? He's getting ready for the pageant. Hi. The boy waved and waved. Angela gave the guest a haughty look and turned to her mother, ignoring the greeting. Got anything to eat? I won't be long. Jake motioned to the refrigerator. I'll eat in my room, Angela said, and left. Peter was kind of embarrassed by the scene. Angela had proven to be an insolent person. Jane seemed to be ashamed of her behavior. Soon loud music came from the room. Some stupid pop. Jake took a plate of pilaf to her daughter. Peter heard the teacher trying to persuade her daughter to turn the music down, as it was impossible to study in such noise. It's my house, I do what I want. If he doesn't like it, let him go to his house. It didn't last long though. Angela found herself at the door again. This time she was wearing ultra-short shorts. What are you looking at? She threw Peter menacingly. Do you like me? Peter blushed. Where are you going? When are you coming back? Jane perked up. She didn't let go of a single remark about her daughter's appearance. Yes, and that, from the looks of it, would have been simply useless. None of your business, replied the girl rudely and slipped out from behind the door. Well, now we can get on with the class. Jane smiled sadly. Why? Why is she like this? The startled Peter could not resist asking. After a moment he realized that such talk might be unpleasant to people Sergeyevna. And the teacher sighed sadly, sat down opposite him. You're already big, you understand a lot. I just failed to cope with the upbringing of my daughter. I teach other children, but I don't know how to bring up myself. Angela was alone. She was never married at all. Angela's father was the kind of guy who avoided responsibility. Adventurous personality. Anyway, it wasn't hard for the seasoned catcher to get the unsophisticated young lady interested. There wasn't even an affair. They spent about 24 hours together. The young lady was in slight shock at how many events these hours contained. Where only she had not been, what only she had not seen. Angela's father knew how to be interesting, knew how to organize exciting leisure time. He tried on different roles and masterfully played them himself, enjoying it. The morning he vanished, as if he was not there. The girl managed to fall in love with him. She was looking for a mysterious beau for a long time, but he seemed to disappear into the water. Well, in memory of the stormy, but such a short-lived romance, she had a daughter. I was even glad then. For a long time I hoped that he would come back. And here I am with a baby. I thought his heart will tremble. We will live together. Then I realized, of course, that it was all nonsense. By that time, Janek had already graduated from the Pedagogical Institute and managed to get a job at the local gymnasium. I had to go on maternity leave. Money became scarce. She lived with her mother in this very apartment. The old woman's pension was small, and her child benefits seemed even smaller. So she took up tutoring, running around all day in other people's apartments. Jane had to wade through a wall of reluctance and sometimes even disgust from her students. Not too pleasant, but it paid good money. Angela at this time to keep an eye on her grandmother, and she was the first to notice the alarm bells. Something, she's too capricious, she's always being pulled somewhere. She doesn't listen to me at all. I punish her, but she doesn't care. Today she cut my favorite sweater with scissors to spite me. She was looking at me on purpose, waiting for a reaction. Mom, what are you talking about? Jane objected tiredly. She's only 2.5 years old. What revenge? What disobedience? The child is just learning about the world, that's all. It's normal. She loved it when her daughter ran to meet her at the door in the evening. The first thing she'd do was look in the bag for something tasty, and she'd always find a chocolate bar, sweet fruit, or flavored buns. She did her best to please her daughter. Who else is going to make her happy? There's no father. Time passed. Angela went to kindergarten. Her mother went back to grammar school. This is where the trouble started. Now the teachers complained about Angela that she hits other children, encourages the boys to mischief, spits. The woman promised to talk to her daughter, to improve the situation, and talked. But with her mother, Angela behaved like a real angel. It seemed that everyone was slandering the poor girl. Both the grandmother and the caretakers. And then Jane's mother died suddenly, a heart attack, and the woman was left alone with her daughter. It was just about time for Angela to start first grade. But then Jane herself had to admit that there was something wrong with her daughter. Angela absolutely refused to learn. The girl was prepared for school at a paid center. They didn't talk about the problems there. Why scare clients who are paying good money? It turned out that Angela can neither read, nor write, nor operate even the smallest numbers. And worst of all, she doesn't want to learn those skills. Jane tried her best. She practiced with her daughter every day, patiently endured her whims and reproaches. Only threats worked. Read the page, solve the examples, then go outside. Otherwise you'll stay at home. The street beckoned her with terrible force. Sitting at home in four walls, it was for her like a prison. The girl shouted at her mother, called her names, threw notebooks and textbooks at the wall, but she still had to fulfill her parents' demands. Angela was weaker than her mother then, physically weaker. And then, as she grew older, Angela simply moved her mother aside and went outside, or ran away when she was at work. A woman couldn't keep her daughter on guard 24 hours a day. Sometimes Angela wouldn't make it home from school and would go straight to the neighborhood with her dubious friends. Janet was worried about her daughter and did not understand what to do. Prohibitions did not help. Angela cheated, insulted her mother, and took valuables from the house, which she apparently then sold. She needed something to go out on. The first time I smelled cigarettes from 10-year-old Angela. After drinking alcohol, the teacher's daughter showed up for the first time at the age of 13. Jane-sama talked a lot with her girl, telling her how such behavior could turn out, what troubles await teenagers on the street. But Angela only smiled and looked at her mother condescendingly, as if she were a fool. She was worried about her daughter. She still hoped that education could overcome genetics. The woman took Angela to psychologists and psychotherapists, but all in vain. The older Angela got, the greater the chasm between them. It was so unlike Jane's relationship with her own mother. No warmth of heart, no mutual support, no shared interests. Angela seemed to despise her mother for her dull gray life of poverty, intellectualism. The girl herself considered herself an ideal. She could afford to do what she wanted. For example, to send a teacher in the classroom for the fact that she was picking on her appearance or smoking right on the school porch. Gradually, the parent turned into a raw material appendage for Angela. Her mother fed her, earned her money, her mother gave her a roof over her head. She was only needed for all this. True, she had to pay, listen to the occasional lecture. But Angela had long ago learned to ignore them. Maybe it's just her age, Peter suggested after listening to the teacher. There was so much pain in Jane's eyes that he wanted something to comfort her. That's what I hope. That she'll come to her senses and think about the future, so long as nothing happens to her in the meantime. I'm so scared for her. Well, we're getting a little distracted. You need to study. Open your textbook to page 3. Peter came to see Jane every Sunday. They studied hard for the pageant. They also drank fragrant tea with delicious homemade pastries and talked about very interesting topics. I tried to answer all of Peter's questions. She didn't dismiss a single one. She was wise, sensitive, and worried. Sometimes Angela was at home during these sessions. One day she barged into the hallway at all, drunk at 15. She reeked of booze, tobacco smoke, and the girl's legs wouldn't hold her. It was late morning. Looks like Angela hadn't been home last night. The girl collapsed in the hallway. Peter helped the teacher carry the body to the bed. Angela was even worse than the aggressive girls at the orphanage. Those were toughened by their hard fate and the need to fight for survival. What about Angela? She has everything: clothes, her own room, delicious food, and most importantly, such a wonderful mom. Angela once insulted Jane in front of Peter. She tried to ask her daughter if she would be back for dinner. The girl was already irritated about something. She unleashed an angry tirade on her mother, and Peter stood up for Jane. And then something happened that the boy did not expect. The girl jumped up to him and slapped him so hard that his eyes went black. "You're going to tell me what to do in my own house." Angela's eyes burned with evil fire. "You bitch." From then on, Peter thought the girl was crazy sick. Well, it happens. People with mental disorders don't necessarily look like fools. Some of them are geniuses. A normal person can't be like that. One time, the kid even shared his hunches with his teacher. Worried before the conversation, afraid to offend Jane, but the latter realized that it was just an expression of concern for herself. No, there's nothing wrong with her mentally. While Angela was still giving, I had time to show her to several psychiatrists. The verdict is unequivocal: everything is within normal limits. So Peter did not tell anyone about Jane's daughter. The teacher didn't ask him specifically, but he understood it himself. He only shared it with Irene. They always told each other everything. Silly Angela, she doesn't realize her happiness. The girl shook her head. I wish I had a mom like that. Irene felt sorry for the kind teacher. The other children were drawn to Jane, even the worst bullies. And her own daughter? Closer to the date of the contest, one very serious problem came to light. It turned out that the participants had to pay for their own transportation. And this is a lot of money: tickets for the child and the accompanying person, a few days, hotel accommodation, meals. But no, I cannot allocate such an amount. The director of the orphanage immediately refused to take part in this scheme. Peter heard how Jane persuaded the man, convincing him that Peter's participation in the competition was a chance for a normal life. Then she tried to prove that the boy's victory was beneficial for the orphanage itself. You'll have so many sponsors after that. They'll fix the roof, buy clothes for the children, and make a sports ground. He still has to win. Where are the guarantees? He's got a lot of potential. I can't believe that our pupil will beat everyone at an event of this level and scale. Peter was catching every word, and inside he was doing well. Is it because of these financial difficulties he won't even go to the contest? It turns out that he practiced, tried, and hoped for nothing. The boy had a dream goal, and now he felt as if the ground had been knocked out from under his feet. Peter saw how hard his teacher was working for him, looking for money. He was very grateful to her for that, but he had already resigned himself to the fact that nothing was going to work out for Jane. It was obvious, but still she found the money. One morning, before school started, the teacher herself approached Peter. The boy was usually the earliest to get to class. He liked this quiet time in the morning, standing at the window, looking out at the street, while others bustle about before the next school day. "We're going," Jane Peter said with shining eyes of joy. She took out a loan. The payments were exorbitant for her, but she decided to go for it. The boy went to Jane's on Sunday, as usual. He hoped he wouldn't see Angela today, but she was home. She broke the news of the loan to him and rebuked him. He realized he had to be first, and the kid won that contest. Standing on the stage in the spotlight, he felt no excitement. His mind was clear and bright. He had a difficult subject. You could say he was unlucky. But Peter coped. He gave such a monologue that the whole hall applauded him for a long time. The results were to be announced the next day. Jape was worried objectively you were the best, but you can't be sure. And yet one can't rule out black connections. Peter was not among the laureates. They announced third place. Not him. Second place, not him again. James looked hopefully at the stage. Peter was already convinced that it hadn't worked out. And then the host called his name and surname. The hall filled with applause. He returned to the orphanage, where he was greeted as a winner should be greeted. Irene even cried tears of joy, and Jape was generally overjoyed that everything had worked out. Soon people from the boarding school for gifted children came to pick up Peter. For a couple of days they took care of some formal matters, preparation of documents, studies, personal stories of the boy. Peter realized that he was being taken somewhere to some new life, which he deserved, according to Jane. He now had a future, a brilliant future. Peter will become strong, smart, wealthy. He won the lucky ticket thanks to Jane, of course, and the support of Irene. It's very hard to part with them. They're the closest people to Peter. Irene's a worrying person to leave behind. How is she going to be here without him for another 3 years? Who's going to protect her? Jane promised to look after her. And it's still scary and depressing and hard. I mean, it's going to be a long time not seeing my loved ones. On the other hand, to be patient for a few years is worth it, because then he will become an influential and wealthy man, will definitely will do everything for this, and then he will thank Jane and make Irene's life a fairy tale. The second point Peter managed to realize, not immediately, of course. First, the boy spent 3 years in a boarding school for gifted children. It was a real palace with a luxurious garden, a separate room, classrooms equipped with the latest technology, smart, motivated kids. Here Peter finally made friends. He had a lot of common topics and interests with local kids, so friendships formed by themselves. The teachers at the boarding school noticed the smallest abilities of their students and tried to develop them. They were very pleasant and educated people, communication with whom enriched and developed. But such warm relations as with Jane, Peter had not formed with any of them. Peter often remembered his teacher, worried whether it was hard for her to pay off the loan, worried whether Angela was hurting her. After graduating from boarding school, Peter entered a good university without exams. During the years of study, the guy managed to win several world-class competitions, which gave him special preferences. Many boarding school graduates entered prestigious universities in this way, without exams. Scholarship, dormitory, supportive mentors who continued to supervise and accompany students after graduation. Life became easier, calmer, more interesting. While still a student, Peter found a job. He was hired by a large travel agency as a translator. He began to earn good money. That's when he was finally able to return to his hometown. And he was eager to see Jane and, of course, to find Irene. Finding Irene was no problem. The director of the orphanage gave the address of the apartment, which the girl received after graduation from the orphanage as a round orphan. It was some room in a barracks on the outskirts. Always drunken neighbors, mountains of garbage everywhere. Irene graduated from technical school and now worked as a dressmaker's assistant in an attire. She earned pennies, lived in a hole. I never thought you'd come back. Iron's eyes shone like two bright stars in the night sky at the sight of Peter. How grown up and beautiful you've become. How can I leave you? The boy smiled, hugging Iron. I've missed you so much. You won't live here anymore. You won't stay a single day in this horrible house. That same evening, Peter helped Iron move into his parents' apartment. It remained empty the whole time. The old neighbors were no longer in the house. The older ones died, the younger ones moved out. It was a pity. It would have been nice to chat with old friends, but the main thing was that Iron would now live in normal conditions. Peter will be calmer that way, and in general it's nice to realize that a loved one lives in his own apartment. It makes me feel warmer. But Jane could not be found. Her apartment was now occupied by new tenants. The owner sold it to us 2 years ago, said a woman in a robe, who opened the door to Peter. They moved somewhere with their daughter to the country, I think. I don't know the details, and I don't need to know. Peter returned to New York and continued to study and work, but now every vacation he returned home to his hometown, where Iron was waiting for him. After graduating from university, Peter was recruited by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The position was offered immediately responsible and highly paid. As Jane had once assumed, winning a prestigious competition became Peter's ticket to life. Now he was being guided and supervised. Now the boy's life seemed to go on carefully laid rails. Everything seemed to work itself out. Peter bought an apartment in New York. Irene moved in with him. They got married. Peter was moving up the career ladder. He had to work hard, but it paid off. Irene stayed at home, taking care of the kids and the household. She truly enjoyed motherhood and loved her husband very much. It was nice and warm to come home from work. The man made several more attempts to find Jane, but in vain. Her traces were lost after moving out of her old apartment. Too bad, because Peter wanted to thank her so much again, wanted so much for her to see what he had accomplished. All her efforts were not in vain. A good woman deserves to be thanked, and not just verbal gratitude. After a few years, Peter realized that working in the ministry takes too much time and energy. He missed happy and important moments. The son went to the first grade, but the father did not get to the ruler, as there was an urgent meeting. The daughter performed for the first time with a ballet group in the theater, but the busy Peter at this time was conducting important negotiations. And the man decided to go into the restaurant business, and the opportunity to open his own business presented itself at that moment. And now Peter has a chain of restaurants in the capital. He is his own boss. Work, of course, have to work a lot, but the man is quite able to regulate his own schedule so that everywhere have time. And that's just great. Today he stayed up till the night with reports, but tomorrow he has a free day to devote to his beloved family. Peter left the office with a feeling of accomplishment. On the street he smiled with anticipation of meeting his wife and children. And here is this elderly beggar at the restaurant bins. She looks a lot like Jane. That resemblance is frightening, but the woman at the gully certainly can't be her. The teacher has a place to live, and she had a job, which means she has a pension. Hello, Peter. The woman smiled sadly. Is this how you've grown up? Handsome, mature, strong, just like you dreamed. Jane. Still not believing what was happening, Peter asked again. The woman nodded her head. Peter invited her into his office. On the way, they both expressed their joy at the chance meeting, each in their own way. She smiled warmly and a little embarrassed. Peter, on the other hand, talked excitedly about his life and how long he had been looking for her. Finally, they were in Peter's office. It was beautiful and cozy. The man gestured Jane to sit down on a comfortable sofa in the corner, which was put in the office especially for visitors. Then the man himself made coffee for the guest, put in a plate of cookies, which were also intended for visitors. Usually the guests were taken care of, Lena's secretary, but at a time like this she was of course long ago at home. It's late afternoon. It's just amazing that we've met. I've been thinking about you so much, looking for you for so long. I wanted to see you. I wanted you to know the places I've seen because of you. Thanks to yourself, the old woman corrected, looking at Peter with pride. Talented, persistent, hardworking. It was all of this that gave the result. You understand perfectly well that if it weren't for you, I don't know what I would be now. A good man. You'd still be here without me and you'd still be a success. Maybe not so soon. Of course, kids like you, with a backbone, you can tell. You can trust me. I'm experienced. But why you? Peter hesitated, trying to find the words. How did you end up in this position? You must be in need. You can see I've become an old beggar. And speak plainly, Jane sighed. It was obvious that she was uncomfortable in front of her former student, ashamed that he saw her like this. Tell me. All right, Jane nodded. It's a long story, and I can't say I'm surprised by the ending. It was coming. After Peter was taken away to a boarding school for gifted children, she started having a lot of trouble with Angela. The 15-year-old girl now often spent the night with no one, and no one knows where, coming home the morning or even several days after she went missing. Sometimes she was brought by the police, to whom the unhappy mother asked for help. The girl is a minor. Exhortations, threats, heart-to-heart talks, everything went nowhere. She tried to lock her daughter up when she went to work, because she could not work. You have to live with your daughter on something. But the freedom-loving person once snuck off over the balcony, tied some sheets together and rappelled down to the ground from the 4th floor. When she found out about it, she stopped locking up her daughter, because it's just plain dangerous. What if Angela had lost her temper? The daughter now spoke to her mother only in profanity. All of Jane's valuables, jewelry and appliances were missing from the house. While the woman was away, someone even took out the washing machine once. Liusa needed money to drink, to go to the bars that attracted her so much. It seemed that the girl saw no other joys in her life. Although Japé tried to instill in her from childhood a love of beauty to books, trips to the theater, learning new things. In everything that happens to her daughter, Jay partly blamed her bad company. They were teenagers, marginalized from dysfunctional families. They didn't study, they didn't work. I saw the representatives of this society. Glassy, absolutely empty eyes, the stamp of limitation on their faces, ungroomed, always gray and ragged. And these people somehow had a great influence on her daughter. Angela was hospitalized several times. Her young body couldn't stand it. Doctors said that if the teenager continued in the same way, the consequences could be fatal, so she decided to take drastic measures to take her daughter to the country. Yes, sell the apartment and buy a house in a remote village, far away from civilization. Fresh air, physical labor, breaking old ties. Yes, and the change of scenery itself, all this, according to the desperate mother, should bring Angela to her senses. It was hard, just like that, to break away from the forced place, to leave everything and sell the apartment. And there was no guarantee that Angela would get better. I had to try. I had to do something. Did you take her to the doctors? Oh, of course I did. Once I even managed to put her in a clinic, but she ran away from there, and then she refused to see specialists at all. Everything suited her. She didn't think she was sick. You can't carry a girl like that around on a horse. Angela was furious when she learned her mother's decision. At first, she refused to go with her to the village, so she went to the new place alone. The woman was at a loss. She had only made the move for her daughter's sake, but she had found a way out and stayed in the city, living with someone from her own company. So Jane's move backfired. The mother herself pushed her daughter to get even closer to these people. But then Angela came back. Angry, thin, wrinkled, she was rapidly turning into the people she so loved to spend time with. Soon Angela's old friends began to visit the village. Sometimes the girl herself traveled to them in the city. 150 kilometers, it turned out that it was not such an insurmountable distance. The straying continued. Moreover, sociable Angela, and in the village found a similar company. There was a house so overgrown, piled with garbage, with a garden and a leaky roof. In it lived a woman with 5 small children from different fathers. Maybe the lady herself did not know who her children were from, as she was almost always drunk. The house was the scene of endless parties, in which Angela took part with pleasure. Then one day she noticed that her daughter had a rounded belly. Angela was expecting a baby. Yeah, what's the big deal? Her daughter shrugged her shoulders when her mother shared her suspicions with her. I turned 18 a long time ago. I have the right dot. And who's the father? Is the father one of ours from the village? Urban, but only, to be honest, I don't remember his name well. We met at the club. To be honest, I can hardly even remember what he looked like. Well, it's just like you used to be. Doesn't it remind you of anything? Her mother clutched at her heart, and Angela smiled happily. She always liked to shock her mother. Even when she was pregnant, Angela was still living her usual lifestyle, drinking, smoking, disappearing from the city to the village house. Her mother's requests to stop drinking did not affect Angela. It seems that she was completely indifferent to the fate of her own child. "None of your business, Dot," that's all she heard in response to her exhortations. Her grandchild was born well before his due date. He was so tiny, so weak. Angela had been driven to the hospital straight from the street since she was in town. The contractions curled her up in front of the store. The baby was born weak and sick and was left in the hospital. Angela was discharged alone. With the freedom she craved, she plunged headlong into her old life. Jane went to see Denny and communicate with doctors. The baby was not doing well. Angela's lifestyle during pregnancy was not without consequences. Underdevelopment of most organs and systems, heart defects, brain damage. Doctors made it clear that if the baby survived, he would be left profoundly disabled and in need of care for the rest of his life. But life was unlikely to be long either. Doctors unanimously advised giving up the crumb. But how? How was it possible to abandon to the fate of this touching, pale baby with expressive eyes? He already recognized Jane, looked at her, tried to smile at his grandmother. True, Angela at one time was determined to write waivers on her son. "Why do I need him, an invalid? All the more I will give birth to another healthy Dot." And then Angela suddenly changed her mind. She said that, of course, she would take Denny home. As it turned out later, a friend with many children put the young mother's brains in place. The same lady in whose house the village drunkards used to hang out. Children are entitled to allowances, and for the disabled, it's even larger sums. That's all it was. Having a baby didn't change Angela's lifestyle. She became an even more popular lady in certain circles. The woman did not blame herself for what happened to Angela. She knew that she gave her daughter enough time and did everything to make her grow up decent. It didn't work. Now she was taking care of Denny, treating him, developing him, traveling with the baby to doctors. Of course, people, including doctors, wondered where the child's mother was, why his upbringing was being handled by his grandmother. She lied to everyone, saying that her daughter was working so that her son had everything he needed. And she, the grandmother, seemed to only help the young mother of a disabled child. No, the woman was not ashamed of her daughter's behavior. She hadn't been afraid of people's judgment for a long time. She was afraid of something else. Angela could be deprived of parental rights, and Denny would go to boarding school. It is unlikely that he will be left to his grandmother. And the conditions in their house are not so good, and the age for guardianship is already old enough, and the income is meager, so they've been scraping by. And then Angela brought home her husband, a grown man with red, cloudy eyes from constant drinking, and announced that he would live here from now on. She thought that it couldn't get any worse and harder for her. But she was wrong. This Andrew had made her existence a living hell. He immediately felt like the master of someone else's house. Andrew dashingly emptied the refrigerator, not caring to fill it. He didn't care if the old woman used her last money to buy fruit or milk for Denny. The man never cleaned up after himself, swore loudly at Angela and Jane if something was not to his liking. Sometimes he even got handsy, and now they had a bunch of Andrew's friends over to their house. It was unbearable. All night long, the young people were buzzing in the kitchen. Mats, loud laughter, swearing, cigarette smoke all over the house, the clinking of glasses. Sometimes even fights broke out. I couldn't leave. How could I leave Denny with them? Japama jinxed at the sudden return of the tears. He loved me. I was his only hope, and I put up with all this for him. I would have run away a long time ago. As a matter of fact, that's what I did when Denny died. The disabled boy had been given a short life from the very beginning. The disease had taken its toll. Every day the boy grew weaker, thinner, more and more indifferent to what was happening. Nothing pleased him, nothing worried him. Japeligla went with him to the hospital. At first they were in the ward together. Then the child was transferred to the intensive care unit. That was it. Jeperiata several days in a row, when the doctors told her the terrible news. Angela and her partner were also saddened, but only because they had lost their source of income. She realized that she couldn't stay in the same house with her daughter for another minute. It's some kind of alien, scary, heartless creature. It ended with the grandmother fleeing to the capital and trying to survive on a paltry sum. Peter shook his head. What he had heard did not fit in his head. Jane is a kind, caring person, a talented teacher in lives like this. My heart squeezed with pity for this bright person. The teacher didn't deserve such a fate. But now everything will be different for her. Believe it or not, Peter began suddenly, but I was looking for you. I've been looking for you for a long time, just to thank you, and now I've found you. You'll have your own apartment now, cozy, clean, just like it used to be. If your pension isn't enough to live on, you'll work part-time as a tutor? You're a great teacher, you love your work, and your knowledge is useful to people. I have friends whose school children need extra tutoring. They'd thank me 100 times over for a tutor like you. And they will pay well. In this, do not even doubt. I hate to put you through this, Peter. Consider it a debt of gratitude. It must have been hard for you to pay back that loan you took out to send me to the pageant. And me? It's really not worth it to me right now. I'm just glad. I also need to introduce you to my children. And you know my wife. She'll be very happy to see you. She smiled as she looked at her former student. Yes, I'm looking forward to seeing your children too. I'm so happy for you.